So welcome. We've got people from everywhere with us today. So for those who don't already know me, my name is Cindy Nicholson. I'm the CEO and founder of Braintree, which is an executive coaching and leadership company, and I'm based here in Sydney, Australia, as I mentioned. And I just want to take a moment just to thank you all to, taking your time out on a busy day to join us for what I know is going to be an incredibly insightful and energetic conversation. So you're in for a real treat tonight, and it brings me great pleasure to have one of our associates presenting this evening. So Stephen is one of the associates in the Braintree Associate Pool, which we call our Bench of Excellence. I've got a couple of other associates on the program as well this evening. But essentially, our Bench of Excellence is a pool of associates who work within our group and who we support in embracing them as part of our team. And there's many benefits to work with us as an associate, and one of them is being able to take centre stage at our monthly group coaching sessions, so we can really show off their insights and skills and experience that our associates are really eager to share with you. So today, Stephen is going to be sharing a presentation that we will all be able to relate to. And as you know, it's entitled, Are You Captain of Your Own Ship? And Stephen's going to talk about management of stress and pressure from within the experience rather than from outside the experience. And the ultimate question is really, is the stress handling you, or are you managing that stress, handling that stress? So that's what we're going to really be talking about. Now, I'm going to just let you know that Stephen is amazing, right? He's just amazing. He's an executive psychologist, he's a business coach, and he specializes in helping leaders through their own transition. And he assists those leaders when they're really facing limitations, making big decisions without the support or the data of others. And when they're questioning their roles or they're experiencing uncertainty or disruption, transition of change and transformation. And his niche is really guiding those leaders moving from being the experts to managers of experts, or from operational to senior leadership and between leadership styles. And I have to tell you that Stephen is also a doting grandfather. I know, because I've seen evidence of him with his granddaughter, and it looks amazing. So we're really keen to hear from Stephen. And to help set that conversation off, I just wanted to share a summary of some of those survey questions that you completed ahead of this session. So I'm just going to go through those very quickly, which is really just going to kind of set the scene for part of our conversation and just to share with you what others shared in that feedback. So very quickly, just going to pop over to that and share with you. So we asked everybody who enrolled for this session if they could just answer a few questions, just so we could get a bit of context around the conversation. The first question was, leadership self-development requires developing effective ways of responding proactively to stress, pressure and uncertainty. And just to share with you that the majority of people agreed, strongly agreed or agreed in the context of that question. We didn't have anybody who disagreed or were on the fence with that. Coping effectively with stress, pressure and uncertainty is central to the development of interpersonal skills, emotional intelligence, wisdom in leadership judgment, and building a culture of trust. And most of you strongly agreed with that. And then we asked, taking responsibility in the context of uncertainty, stress and pressure is an essential component of leadership. And again, the majority here, over 68% agreed that they strongly agreed, and 26% said they agreed, and the others were neutral. Then we asked, those who use pressure, stress and uncertainty as an excuse diminish their opportunities for leadership professional development. Again, not as many, just over 50% strongly agreed and 26% agreed. And then we had a little bit more there who were neutral. So I'm sure this is going to come out during the conversation tonight. The next question was, embracing stress, uncertainty and pressure is core to the leadership resilience and resolve. And again, the majority strongly agreed or agreed there. Had slight disagreement, which is interesting. Again, we'd love to find out if anybody has that sort of view and to share that with the group. Question number 6, executive coaching provides the opportunity to develop the skills for managing stress, uncertainty and anxiety. And again, we had a very strong agreement here, and most agreed here. So actually all very positive. Most people were in agreement with all of these questions. By managing stress and anxiety effectively, leaders can turn adversity into opportunity, again, seen as strongly agree, and 26% agreed. So that was just a quick overview of the feedback that we got for that survey. And I think, you know, essentially what we're saying there is that most of the questions that were posed to the group were either agreed to or strongly agreed or agreed. So I'm sure that was interesting feedback for Stephen as a backdrop towards setting off this session this afternoon. Yeah, so with that backdrop, I'd like to get the conversation started. So what I'd love to do now is really hand over to Stephen. He will take us through a presentation that he has very kindly prepared to share with everybody this evening. Immerse yourselves into it, get a glass of water, enjoy. Just like to hand over to you now, Stephen.
Thanks very much, Cindy. Thanks again, and thanks to everyone for coming. I appreciate it very much, and I hope that this can be helpful. So just a little bit about me. I guess over my career of about 50 years, or no, not that bad, 40 years, I've done many different kinds of things. I'm a psychologist, a business coach. I was also one of the first people internationally to work with philosophy as a form of counseling. And having left the university now, I see myself, I work as an academic consultant as well. I want to just contextualize this evening's presentation by looking at where it came from in terms of me. In my coaching work, in my coaching and therapy work as well, actually, I work with many people who are quite aggressive and full of anger. And one of the things that often crops up is that they feel they cannot help their anger. They're aggressive. They find themselves being aggressive. And so using a phrase of Nelson Mandela's, I use in the coaching context, are you captain of your ship, or is your ship, or are you captive of your ship? You know, so does your anxiety get the better of you? Does your anger get the better of you? Does pressure drag you around? Does stress drag you around? Or are you master? Have you developed some kind of mastery of your stress? And I take it from Nelson Mandela for two reasons. The one is that he quotes his favorite poem was Invictus by William Henley. And he says, I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. And I think that I'm not going to go into anything about Mandela's history in any detail, but I think that for anyone who heard of Mandela and maybe knows of Mandela, one will also know the adversity that he worked through in order to say this. He had to overcome his anger, his hurt, his feelings of humiliation. And it wasn't a straightforward journey. It was a journey of self-overcoming. And that theme that I want to push tonight is the process of overcoming in becoming a leader or becoming a senior executive. We often speak about crucible moments in leadership. I think that what we often don't talk about is the process of overcoming those moments, those crucible moments. And I think that the life and being of Mandela is very helpful in understanding the process of overcoming. And related to this is, I hope that you'll agree with me, if you look at this bloke here, he looks intense, he looks angry. It's his anger has got the better of him rather than him getting the better of his anger. And so this promotes a question which comes out of the Mandela experience as well, is it's all well and good to talk about self-awareness in general, but where it's very crucial to have self-awareness is when you're working under conditions of real-time pressure or real-time uncertainty in an organization or any other context. And that kind of attunement or awareness of yourself in context is not always very easy to get. It's often easier to have that awareness from outside rather than from within the leadership situation. And I'll just give you two examples from clients of mine. The one is Mark, because that's not his real name, but Mark was an operations manager, and he he said, under everyday conditions, everything really goes well and people are friends with each other and they relate to each other. And speaking of himself, he says, under everyday conditions, at the end of the day, when he goes home from work, his drive is about an hour. And he says he uses that time to reflect and kind of meditate on the day's activities and what he's gone through. And he's developed that skill of reflection over a long period of time. And he says, but when it comes into the situation of pressure, his kind of more or less instinctive response of feeling threatened and defensive comes up for him. And he responds from a position of threat and defensiveness. And so by his own acknowledgement, he hasn't mastered the art or the craft of being able to be self-aware in the context of a stressful, threatening experience. And again, I think that's where Mandela is someone that's really instructive, because it was in the context of stress and hurt that he was able to have insight into himself. A second case that I have taken from my own practice is, I call it the case of Michelle. And Michelle is a manager, and one of her obstacles to manage to herself as a manager, especially in group contexts, in meetings, is that she talks too much. By her own acknowledgement, she talks too much. So from outside, she knows that she talks too much. But when she gets into the actual meeting situation, she loses sight of the fact that she talks too much. And she's responding to the anxiety that she feels within the situation. And the anxiety comes to dominate her. And so she goes into the very thing that she doesn't want to go into. She goes into over-talking, not giving others a chance to really talk, seeing others tune out from her talk, but yet still persisting with over-talking. And so what I'd like to say of both these cases is that in situation, they're not captains of the ship. In situation, their particular anxiety or threat has got the better of them. And so the process of becoming captain of one's own ship is a process of moving from the anxiety, the pressure, whatever the emotion is actually, from the emotion getting the hold of you to you getting the hold of the emotion and making it work for you instead of kind of distorting your awareness in situation. And of course, we can speak about this process in terms of so many different emotions: anxiety, stress, pressure, resentment, anguish, depression. And I think the envy would be another one that we could speak about in this context. Jealousy would be another one, getting the better of us so much of the time. How can we work from, let's say, the distortions of envy to actually establishing a different kind of relationship to ourselves and to the situation through that envy? So what I'd like to make is a distinction between two kinds of awareness: reflexive awareness and reflective awareness. And the thing about reflective awareness is it's reflection about a situation, or it's reflection on a situation. But it usually, it is from outside of the situation. It's kind of after the session or after the day's work that reflection occurs. And of course, it's a great tool. I'm not knocking that at all. It's definitely a part of the coaching and the therapeutic journey. But there's also what's called reflexive awareness. And the reflexive awareness is a form of awareness from within a situation. So, for example, one will usually find top sports people, let's say Nadal, Federer, Djokovic, on court. They are able, within the situation, within the tension of the situation, within the pressure of the situation, they are able to modify their moods in response to that experience. I also think stand-up comedians, good stand-up comedians, are also able, in the context of the tension of the situation, to be reflexively aware of themselves and to moderate themselves accordingly. I often think of Jerry Seinfeld. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Seinfeld, but you can almost watch him watching himself as he does his comedy show. And so, again, just repeating something that was said earlier, Mandela's awareness is a reflexive awareness. I'm also not saying he doesn't have a reflective awareness. Of course, he has a strong reflective awareness, but he has a very powerful reflexive awareness. And that is being able to be reflexive in the context of situations in which he's under high levels of pressure. I'll just give a situation here, which he recalls, speaking of his time in prison. He speaks of an occasion in which, the prisoners on Robben Island were entitled to only 2 letters a year. And on those 2 occasions, when he was entitled to a letter, the prison wardens used to come up to his cell and they would say to him, Mandela, okay, not Mr. Mandela, Mandela, here's your letter. And as he put out his hand to take it through the bars, they pulled it away and they packed up laughing, and they did it again. Mandela did not react to them. Okay, there was no knee-jerk reaction. There was no shouting. He stood still, calmly, in his dignified manner, and never lost that sense of dignity. And he says that afterwards he would take it up with the authorities in the appropriate ways, and he would get the letters. So that's just one example of Mandela being reflexively aware in situation. I've also taken an example from a yoga teacher speaking about reflexive awareness. And I'll just read to you what she says. She says, the most important type of spiritual growth, practical wisdom, and authenticity doesn't happen when you're meditating or on your yoga mat. It happens in the midst of conflict, when you are frustrated, angry, or scared, doing the same old thing. But then suddenly you realize that you have a choice to do it differently. And it's kind of this moment of sudden awareness in the context of action, where you realize that the way you're responding is not determined by the situation alone. It's you actually have a choice of how to respond in situation. And so it's that moment of coming to that clarity of awareness and saying, I can do it in different ways. So I'd like to just take us on a little trip of Mandela, because what I'd like to say is, I guess, both reflective and reflexive awareness are not automatic. They're not kind of gifts that you're born with. They are part of it, what it means to be human. And Mandela always said to people that his way of leading, who he is not a saint. It emerges out of his being as a human. And so it's very human dynamics that he's talking about. And so I'd like to just explore this human dynamic of Mandela's. And so in a letter to his wife, Winnie, while he was in jail, he makes the following comment. He says, I feel I have been soaked in gall. Every part of me, my flesh, bloodstream, bone, and soul. So bitter am I to be completely powerless to help you in the rough and fierce ordeals you are going through. Again, just to emphasize that, Mandela wasn't born a saint, and Mandela was dealing with adversity in jail, and he was dealing with moments of powerlessness and bitterness in his experience of jail. But the point is that he worked with them, he worked with them while he was in jail, to the point, there are hundreds of points, but to one of the quotations from him, the day he was leaving jail, and there were hundreds and thousands of people outside waiting for him. And he goes into a moment of reflexive awareness. And he says, as I walked out the door towards the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison. And so again, we see something about Mandela catching himself in the moment, and in the moment being able to kind of reformulate himself, to able to kind of develop a different take on reality. And again, it's not only Mandela that does this. I think a lot of leaders are capable of this. Again, I think a lot of sports people, teachers are also capable of this. In the context of Mandela, it culminated in a very amazing moment in the history of South Africa. And I don't know if many of you will recall the 1995 World Cup, in which the Springboks, South Africa, won the World Cup. And Mandela came onto the field at the prize-giving ceremony, totally unexpectedly. No one except Francois Pienaar, the South African captain, and the South African team knew that he would make an appearance. And he came onto the field in the jersey of what had been his oppressors. So the Springboks were not really big apartheid proponents. And so Mandela here surprised everyone, even the ANC, his comrades, so to speak, were not happy with what he was doing at this time, but he embraced it, and he came onto this field in this jersey, in this jumper, and the crowd inside the stadium, outside the stadium, on the TV went absolutely ballistic. I was there at the time. Everyone went ballistic. And when Francois Pienaar got up to speak, he said something to the effect, I know that there are 45 million people behind us today. That was one of the pivotal moments in the history of South Africa. That moment that Mandela was a master of surprise. He knew how to use surprise for cultural, for strengthening cultural capital, so to speak. And in this moment, everyone was a person. We weren't black, we weren't white, we weren't male, we weren't female. We weren't from this culture, we weren't from that culture. We were truly human in this moment. And I'm sure many of you might be familiar with the African word Ubuntu, which means that people are people through other people. And this was a moment of Ubuntu in South Africa. And so again, Mandela's rising above the challenge. So what I'd like us to be seeing is that Mandela went through trauma. It's not that he just became the leader because he was born a leader or because he came from a royal background. He went through hell in becoming a leader. And so a question that I would like to pose is, how do you think he moved from A to B? What goes into that kind of transformation from being overwhelmed by one's emotions, from being not captain of one's ship, from being in jail in one's ship, from being captive of one's ship, to actually becoming a captain of one's ship? What kind of transformation goes in there? And we haven't got time to take that in the group as a whole, but I'd like you to put in the chat box 1 or 2 words, just kind of free associating, not thinking too much, just free associating with what comes into your mind moment about this kind of process. How did he move from A to B? And I want to situate it in the context of 2 philosophies, really, Stoicism and existentialism. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this notion of Stoicism, in which Epictetus says, men are not disturbed by things, but by the attitude they take of things. Okay, so it's not just simply the event that disturbs us, it's our attitude towards the event that disturbs us. And another way of saying it, also by Epictetus, is that we tend to want to say, when we're angry, we tend to want to say, I'm angry because of what you did to me. She's making me angry. He's making me angry. And Stoicism, Epictetus says, you in charge of your response to a situation. If you are angry, it's you who's chosen anger in response to that situation. And so it's you that needs to take responsibility for the way in which you respond to the situation. For Stoicism, this is part of the process of leadership development, that you learn to take responsibility for your attitude. You don't blame others. It's not to say that others might not be doing something wrong, whatever that word means, or it might, someone might be shouting at you or very angry with you. There might be that. But it's your choice of how to respond to that. Just going back to that example of Mandela in prison, where the wardens came to taunt him, and he chose his response in the context of that situation. Whereas I know for myself, I would have collapsed and had a very strong knee-jerk reaction rather than seeing that I choose my response. So where I'd like to come to an existential perspective is that Stoic philosophy has, in the end, it has a negative view of the emotions. What they believe is that we need to get rid of our emotions. I think the word that's often used is we need to extirpate our emotions. We need to get rid of emotions. And so in Stoicism, there's a strong sense of self-denial when it comes to our emotions, not to work with them, but to get rid of them, to deny them. Whereas from an existential perspective, it's all about overcoming ourselves. Life is a journey of self-overcoming, and we find that in kind of a range of many philosophers, many existential philosophers, and of course other philosophers as well, that life is a process of self-overcoming. And this, I think, is very congruent with the Mandela perspective, where he says everyone can rise above their circumstances and achieve success if they are dedicated to and passionate about what they do. So this process of rising above our circumstances is a process of overcoming ourselves. And then a further quote from Mandela: I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. And again, in contrast to the Stoics, Mandela is saying, work with your fear, work through your fear. Don't let your fear hook you, which I think is what a lot of us do. Our anger hooks us, our fear hooks us, our uncertainty hooks us. And Mandela is saying, no, overcome our fear. And again, just reinforcing that from Mandela, the brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who overcomes that fear. So again, we see process of overcoming. And I've taken a step back here, a quotation from a philosopher who writes on existentialism, saying that this process of overcoming is a human process. Again, it's not a cultural process. It's not my culture. It's not your culture. It's not me as a man, you as a woman, your nation, my nation. It belongs to the human condition, that the human condition is such by its very nature, human beings are able to kind of take a step back. And I don't mean rationally take a step back. I mean emotionally take a step back from the situations in which we find ourselves. And this ability to take a step back is central to putting things in perspective, gaining proportion, reframing our situations, seeing things in new ways. And also, as we saw with Mandela, being kind of able to come onto the rugby field of his oppressors with the journey of his oppressors to unite a nation, to unite 45 million people for a moment, people who kind of had a whole history of fear, hate, etc., towards each other. What we can say of Mandela is that he chooses his attitude in a situation. And so I've just taken this quote from him as well. He says, "I've been abused physically and emotionally. I didn't get to see my children grow up. I was separated from my wife, and it ultimately led to the end of our marriage. Then I realized they could take it all except my mind and my heart. And I just made a decision not to give them away." So here again, we see in the face of hugely adverse situations that he is taking a choice. He's making a decision about what I'll call the overcoming or the transcendental parts of being a human, the mind and heart. They could take everything away from him, except that. And I know Bill Clinton once wrote an article on Mandela's spirit in this way. Yeah. So it's all well and good to say this. How do we even begin to choose our attitudes in situations? Because we don't even generally, for the most part, in everyday life, we don't realize that we're operating under a set of attitudes. You know, just like that old image of a fish doesn't see the water in which it swims. So we tend not to see the attitudes in which we swim. We tend to think that we're seeing things as they are. We tend to think that we've got the perspective of reality. We don't tend to see that our perspective is shaped by an attitude that we've chosen. And so because of this, we tend to blame others when something goes wrong, or we tend to say, well, he made me angry, she made me cross, etc. So how do you begin to see your attitudes? And I've taken an example here, again, from Mandela. And this was Mandela in the 1950s, where he had escaped South Africa illegally. So he was, in South African terms, he was a terrorist. In terms of his terms, he was a freedom fighter. But he escaped through the borders of South Africa. He was flying between countries in Africa. And he says he got onto a plane. So he said, we put down briefly in Khartoum, where we changed to an Ethiopian Airways flight to Addis Ababa. Here I experienced a rather strange sensation, and I'm emphasizing the word strange sensation. As I was boarding the plane, I saw that the pilot was black. I had never seen a black pilot before, and the instant I did, I had to quell my panic. He says, how could a black man fly a plane? But a moment later, I caught myself. I had fallen into the apartheid mindset, thinking Africans were inferior and that flying was a white man's job. I sat back in my seat and chided myself for such thoughts. So there are a number of points about this. Firstly, Mandela is catching himself in the moment. So he's catching his mindset in the moment of that mindset. And what I'd like to also emphasize is that there's a specific word that he uses for this, that catching, and he calls it a strange sensation. You know, he felt the strange sensation. And not only did he feel the strange sensation, but he was also attuned to his body. He was attuned to his emotions. He was attuned to these strange sensations, which I think that, you know, a general kind of dominant views of, macho leadership is not about tuning in to your emotions, to the sensations you're feeling. But Mandela was very attuned to what he was experiencing, what he was feeling at the time. And this was part of his power, that he could do this and he could reframe the situation. He's reframing his mindset. He's reframing his situation. And so what I'd like to say is that reframing is a central part of a Mandela process of leadership. And I'd like to say that process is divided into 3 moments. I should have used the word reflexive here. Accepting plasticity, and I'll explain that in a minute. Reflexivity and reframing. Accepting plasticity means accepting that you are stuck in a particular situation, you know. So for Mandela, it was accepting that he was in jail. But I've just used an example here of being in a traffic jam. When you're in a traffic jam, the fasticity of the situation is such that you can't get out of it. But that doesn't mean you accept it. I think that most people don't accept the fasticity or the stuckness of being in a traffic jam. And because they don't accept the fasticity, they get frustrated, their blood pressure boils, they get angry, and they become kind of almost the traffic jam is dominating them. They are captive of the traffic jam. Whereas with this kind of bloke here, you see that he's accepted the fasticity. He's accepted the stuckness of being in a traffic jam. But not only has he accepted the stuckness of being in a traffic jam, he's totally reframed the experience. So he's chosen a very different way of responding. And so he's kind of saying, I accept I'm in a traffic jam. Being in a traffic jam opens up another set of possibilities to me. And so he reframes it. And I think it's the same with all of us in a traffic jam, you know. If we're able to accept the fasticity, if we're able to accept being stuck in a jam, we're able to open up other possibilities for ourselves, you know, including meditating. So what I'd like to do is just go back to the notion of the strange sensation that Mandela, that example from Mandela captured. And I'd like to say that that's what is called a felt sense of a situation. And a felt sense of a situation does come up in moments of strangeness. It comes up in moments of feeling that things are not quite right. There's something there, but it's not quite right, and you can't put your finger on it. The same with things of the tips, of the things being on the tip of one's tongue. And the crucial thing again here is being able to listen and stay with these experiences of a strange sensation, to stay with that experience of doubt. You know, something's not quite right. I don't know what it is, but to stay with it, not to kind of ignore it, and to develop the capacity, to develop the skill, if you like, of staying with it. And there was a book written by Andy Grove, who was the CEO of Intel in the late 80s and early 90s. And he wrote a book called Only the Paranoid Survive. And the underlying theme of the book was the role of worry in his strategic management style, and his leadership style. And he said that he learned to listen to his worry. He said that worry alerts you to danger. Rational thinking itself doesn't alert you to danger. Worry is what alerts you to danger. And so worry is what alerted him to what was going on in Intel. You know, he didn't just react on a rational basis. His worry allowed him to be tuned into different levels of Intel. It also enabled him to tune into threats from competitors. And that ability to tune into the threats from competitors, again, wasn't just a rational diagram. It was underpinned by the emotion of working with worry. And so I guess the central point being made here is that these felt senses that we have are clues to reframing the situation, to seeing things in new ways, and to being alert to things that we are not alert to when we're acting only in a rational mindset. So it's kind of refining our emotional intelligence, if you like. But it's again, refining it under conditions of tension and pressure, not just from outside, from when we are within the situation. So I thought I would just give some examples of Mandela, again, speaking about this. And one of the earlier examples he speaks about is what was called the Defiance Campaign. The Defiance Campaign was, well, defying the authorities in South Africa. And what he said is, up until the Defiance Campaign, people were scared and feared, and, you know, they didn't defy. But once they'd embraced defiance, they were liberated to respond to their conditions of oppression in new and different ways. They had kind of shaken off the shackles of fear and were able to, they embraced their fear and they were able to form a united front of struggling. And so they were reframing. And again, just to get the point home again, some other quotes from Mandela on accept fasticity, ponder and reframe. So when he was put in the prison cell, he accepted it and he said, and he reframed it and he said, at least if nothing else, the cell gives you the opportunity to look daily into your entire conduct, to overcome the bad and develop whatever is good in you. So again, even in the heart of prison, where he was sleeping on the floor in the cell, he was able to reframe by accepting the fasticity of the process. And again, he says, on the island, we felt cut off, and indeed we were. We had the consolation of being with each other, but that was the only consolation. My dismay was quickly replaced by a sense that a new and a different fight had begun. Okay, so again here we see him reframing the situation and finding the possibilities in adversity, and so still being guided by those possibilities that he was committed to. And I think commitment plays a strong sense. And here's just another example, which I like. So what this example was is that the prisoners on Robben Island were taken out every day into kind of the blistering sun and taken to work at the quarry. And they had to dig, and it was futile work, and it was purposely futile work, just to kind of try and break the spirit of the prisoners. And so Mandela says, but those first few weeks at the quarry had the opposite effect on us. Despite blistering and bleeding hands, we were invigorated. I much preferred being outside in nature, being able to see grass and trees, to feel the wind blowing in from the sea. It felt good to use all one's muscles with the sun at one's back, and there was simple gratification in building mounds of stone and lime. Okay, so again, we see reframing the situation and living in it in a very different kind of way. And there are a group of philosophers that have also written around this, but I think we don't have time for that. So the ultimate one was that the jail was reframed as a university. It became a badge of honor to go to Robben Island. It was a place of education, and it was in-situation education as well. And the wardens eventually let them do what they wanted. So the prisoners were able to kind of read, learn, enter dialogues with each other. Mandela says they practiced the art of Socratic dialogue in prison. And so again, the acceptance, he accepted the possibility of death. And he said, to be truly prepared for something, one must actually expect it. And he goes on to say, we were all prepared, not because we were brave, but because we were realistic. So again, they embraced the fear of death, and embracing the fear of death allowed them to open up possibilities. He also said that crucial to this process of reframing is embracing responsibility for your actions. And he says they could have easily developed a victim's mentality. We could always blame our troubles on the white man. We must also look within ourselves and become responsible for our actions. And I think it was in the heart of becoming responsible under conditions of adversity that Mandela and the African National Congress and the African people in general were able to develop well, for the time of Mandela, an amazing philosophy of kind of inclusivity and embracing your enemy, embracing the other, and having dialogue with the other. So I'd just like to end it off with what I've called here the Mandela Challenge. And the Mandela Challenge is a challenge to all of us to ask these kinds of questions. Describe an experience in your leadership journey in which you have been called on to overcome yourself. How have you moved from A to B on that journey? Describe one in which you have met the challenge to overcome and one in which overcoming was problematic and maybe hard and challenging. And thirdly, how do you see yourself as a leader when you look through the eyes of Mandela's experience of overcoming himself? What is your relationship to overcoming? Where are you? Where are we in this journey of overcoming ourselves? Thank you.
Wow, Stephen, that was incredible. I just got to thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I'm sure I say that on behalf of everybody, about how I felt that I was totally immersed in this presentation, and I found it to be really moving and incredibly powerful. So, it's just after the hour. I'm conscious people have evenings and days to get on with. So I just want to thank you very, very much indeed for opening up, trusting us, spending your time with us through this last hour, trusting in us to bring you value. Everybody's time is incredibly precious, including the people who put these webinars together, and especially Stephen. So we do like to get your feedback. We do love to hear what you have to say about the experience that you've had, not just within this forum, but we also like to put it out to some feedback that would be most appreciated. We really do value the time and effort that Stephen has put into bringing this presentation together. So what we ask of you is just one ask, and that is please do leave positive feedback for him. Now, everybody knows that whenever we do our webinars, we always give something away. So we would love to invite you to book in a meeting, book in a conversation that Stephen and I can join in for you. We can talk about mindset, we can talk about reframing, we can talk about any of the things that came up for you during this session. You can pick a time and we will be more than willing to spend that time with you one-on-one and to really help you address some of those mind shifts and reframing that you might feel can be helpful to you as you go through. We would love you to continue to keep up to date with us. Follow us on our social media platforms. Check us out on our website pages so that you can see the upcoming webinars. We have amazing associates and speakers we'd love to bring to you as often, every month as we do here. On behalf of everybody, and behalf of Braintree, just really thank you, Stephen, for such an inspiring and immensely interesting presentation. And I think we've all come away with some changes in our lives just from the hour that we've spent with you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you all very much.